In this video, we are going to briefly distinguish between the two major types of classification problem. And as you probably figure it out, the two major kinds of classification problem, or the two major ways to classify our data, are the unsupervised technique and the supervised technique. So, classification problems are the different data mining techniques to identify and to classify an observation into a distinct cluster. And as I mentioned briefly before, there are two ways to classify data: the supervised approach and the unsupervised approach. In other words, there are two ways to correctly assign each observation to its group affiliation. When we use the supervised approach to classify data, we predetermine the classes of the data by telling the algorithm of the computer which attributes, which characteristics correspond to which data vector. When we use the supervised approach to classify data, the targets are predetermined because we tell the computer algorithm which attributes, which characteristics corresponds to which vector. So what are the targets? Targets can be either inputs, or sometimes we call them independent variables, or outputs, or sometimes we call them dependent variables. We essentially tell the computer algorithms which independent or dependent variables correspond to which data vector. Because of that, this way of classifying data is called the supervised approach. Logistic regression and the support vector machines are two most popular examples of the supervised approach. If you are familiar with especially the logistic regression, I'm sure you know the dependent variables are predetermined or predefined when we use the logistic regression, and the independent variables are also predetermined. We operationalize our variables in such a way to indicate what represents a heavy drinker, a binge drinker, a light drinker, a non-drinker. We also maneuver our data in such a way to indicate who are the heavy, moderate, light, or non-smokers. So, as you can see, as an example of a supervised approach, the logistic regression has its classes predetermined. We essentially indicate if a person consumes this and this number of drinks in a number of days, how should we classify that person? Should we classify that person as a heavy drinker, or should we classify that person as a moderate drinker, or should we classify that person as a binge drinker, or if the person's in a survey question indicates that he or she does not drink alcohol at all. So in this case, should we classify that person as a non-drinker? So as you can see, we classify the person according to the types of drinking patterns based on the number of drinks per day, or the standards specified by any government agencies. And when we use unsupervised approach to classify data, we essentially try to uncover the subgroups with distinct attributes or distinct characteristics that can result in different clusters within the same data set. So, when we use unsupervised approach to classify data, the classes are not predetermined. We did not specify beforehand, based on the number of cigarette smokes per day, how should we classify that person? As non-smoker, light smoker, moderate smoker, or heavy smoker? We just classify individuals or observations or counties or states within the same data set based on their values pertaining to different measures. The measures can be income, smoking behavior, drinking behavior, and whatnot. Because of that, any variance of cluster analysis, it can be hierarchical clustering or k-means clustering or other types of cluster analysis, or the two-step cluster analysis in SPSS, which is a combination of both k-means and hierarchical clustering. They all fall under unsupervised method of classifying data. So, as you probably figured out, the supervised and unsupervised methods of classifying data, they just differ in how data is being classified. And when we use the supervised approach to classify our data, the attributes or characteristics are predetermined, and sometimes the targets or the inputs and outputs are also predetermined. As I mentioned in the previous slides, we classify people into different drinking or smoking categories based on the number of drinks per day or the number of cigarette smokes per day or in a week. And we classify different loan statuses: current, overdue, paid off or charged off, or in grace period, based on whether payment is being made on time or how far the payment is late. And when we use the unsupervised approach to classify data, we essentially let the computer algorithm to decide which attributes or characteristics corresponds to the data vector. We don't predetermine who is a heavy, light, or moderate smoker based on the number of cigarettes smoked, or who is a heavy, moderate, or light drinker based on the number of drinks per day. We let the computer algorithm decide. And when we use unsupervised approach to classify data, we are essentially trying to uncover observations with distinct but similar characteristics. And when we find a group of observations with distinct and similar characteristics, we group these observations into a unique cluster. And when we keep grouping observations or individuals or states into different distinct and unique clusters, we can compare the differences among those clusters in terms of the mean numbers of drinks per day or the median number of cigarettes smoked. And the supervised and unsupervised methods of classifying data also differ in how variables are being specified. As I mentioned before, When we use supervised approach to classify data, the independent and dependent variables are predetermined. Or even if we don't predefine the inputs or independent variable, at least we determine the outcome or dependent variable beforehand to indicate the focus of our study or research. And when we use the unsupervised approach to classify data, there's no inputs or outputs in our analysis. We don't distinguish our variables as inputs or outputs, or as independent and dependent variables. We just let the computer algorithm decide and see what patterns we find. So essentially, we let the computer algorithm do what they like and see what they find. And here are the main examples of supervised learning approach to classify data. Any variance of regression, it can either be the OLS or ordinary least square regression, or the logistic regression, the ridge regression, the lasso, the quantile regression, any variance of the spatial regression falls under the supervised approach of classifying data. When we use any kinds of regression, I'm sure you realize we always pre-specify the dependent and independent variable. And sometimes we classify individuals into different categories of smoking or drinking behaviors based on the reported numbers of drinks or cigarette smoked per day. So we also predefine the independent variables in this case. And any classification techniques, whether it's parametric or non-parametric, they all falls under the category of supervised approach of classifying data. Logistic regression is one famous example of parametric classifying techniques. And other examples of parametric classification techniques are linear discriminant analysis, quadratic discriminant analysis, naive Bayes, neural networks, and so on. And k-nearest neighbors, support vector machines, decision trees are famous examples of non-parametric classification techniques. I'm sure many of you have done principal components analysis. It's one kind of factor analysis, we all know that. So when we do either the principal components analysis or factor analysis, I'm sure you realize there's no predefined independent and dependent variables. We just group all these measures or variables into different factors when we do PCA or factor analysis. And when we attempt to classify observations or the rows instead of factors or the columns, we use any kinds of cluster analysis, be it k-means or hierarchical clustering. So any kinds of cluster analysis falls under the unsupervised method of classifying data. So just remember, when we do PCA or factor analysis, we are classifying the columns of the data, or the variables, or the measures of the data. When we do cluster analysis, we are essentially classifying the rows of the data. So, whether it is the supervised or the unsupervised methods of classifying data, the inputs and outputs can be anything. They can be either real numbers, ratio, percentages, membership in a category, and so on and so forth.